Hey folks, welcome back. In this week's video, we're going to take a look at how you can draw cylinders, tapered cylinders, and cones using a grid. And if you've watched my other two videos, we talked about drawing spheres and ellipsoids and the actual grid itself. We're working our way from the simplest volumetric shapes to draw to the most complex. So the first thing you'll notice here is that I have a grid. I didn't draw this grid. This grid I had available to me from within Photoshop. If I press the Command key and single quote, this toggles the visibility of my grid. If you're on a Windows machine, Control single quote will do the same thing. So that's really handy because it allows us to have another visualization tool when we're drawing. Now the problem with that is if I attempt to draw, you can see that my lines turn out to be really wavy because right now I have snap turned on. Essentially, as I'm drawing, Photoshop will try to snap my line to a particular point on this grid, which can be super annoying. So I want to turn that off. To do that, if I go to View, I simply need to uncheck Snap. This will allow me to create a line that does not snap to the actual grid itself. I'm showing you this because we can now create a trapezoidal shape and we can easily see our lines. So I'll just go ahead and make two lines that are going to be in parallel, just like we talked about in the previous video. And I can make my grid. I'm drawing the grid because when I talk about these volumetric shapes, I want to be able to easily show you how these objects are going to be placed along that grid. In fact, what we'll do is we'll just take this grid and we'll make a few copies. If we press Command J on Mac or Control J on Windows, it makes a copy of the existing layer. And then we can use our Move tool to just simply move it down below. So this gives you a little bit more order. If you'd like to see a grid, you can always turn the grid off by hitting Command single quote, goes away. But you may want to leave it on. I'm going to leave it off from this point on. So let's go ahead and make a brand new layer. And we're going to draw our first structure. And before we actually draw it on the grid, I just want to quickly show you what these items are so we can then apply that to the grid. The first is we have a cylinder. Cylinder is, if we're drawing it upright, is essentially we're going to have two caps. These are referred to as caps, and they're going to be connected by a line. And you can see here that this is roughly the same in terms of the size of each cap is the same. This is referred to as just a cylinder. And of course, we can do the same thing on the side. We're drawing a cylinder that is basically resting. And again, the two caps are roughly the same size. This is going to appear a little bit smaller because it's in perspective, but think about it like having two parallel lines. The tapered cylinder has a cap at the bottom and has a usually either smaller or larger cap. Basically, each cap is at a different size. And so we can connect that. And you can see that the lines tend to be, or the form tends to be thicker at the base and then basically starts to get smaller or more narrow as we start to move up. We can easily do this for the resting tapered cylinder as well. Now it's kind of hard to tell in the side view or when you're looking at an object that's resting. It's a little bit difficult to tell whether it's just an exaggerated perspective where this is a really long cylinder or if it's a tapered cylinder. So it's more evident when you look at it upright. So that's referred to as a tapered cylinder. And that's a really important shape. And the last shape that we're going to be looking at today is the cone. And the cone essentially at its simplest level, it's simply one cap and it ends at a point. The cones don't always have to look exactly like this. They can also have a point that is off to one side. And so we can see that this is a cone because it ends at a point. Now what's really interesting, and the reason why I'm lumping all of these three volumetric shapes into one video, is that you can derive a tapered cylinder from a cylinder. The only difference is one of the caps is smaller. You can also take a tapered cylinder and turn it into a cone just by adding a point and then extending the lines from the tapered cylinder to that point. So that's why we're talking about all three in one video. So now that we understand that, let's apply this knowledge to the grid. Let's hide our notes, and we'll just drop the opacity for both of our grids so that we can easily see the lines that we're about to draw. And I'm going to zoom in. And I always like to put things on its own layer so I can move them around. You never want to draw on the same layer because then whatever you've already drawn will be kind of glued to it, right? So I'll make a brand new layer. And if we're drawing a cylinder that is resting upright, we'll start out with an ellipse. That ellipse, and I'll draw two different variants here. The important thing is you don't draw it as a circle. You draw it as an elliptical shape. And what we're going to do is we're going to just extend this shape up, try to keep the same size. It doesn't have to be perfectly straight, as long as the distance between these two edges is roughly the same, right? And I'll draw my dotted lines. And I like to use the lasso tool and make small selections by holding down the shift key and cutting. So we have one cylinder here. We'll draw another normal cylinder up top. Now, how do you know which side to make into dotted lines? So the dotted lines, just as a refresher, basically it's the contour, but we don't see it because we're looking at it straight on. So this is kind of hidden from view. So typically when I draw my contours, the opposite side will have the dotted lines. In the base of this particular shape here, we're not seeing the back edge of the cylinder. And that's how I know I can get rid of that. It's hidden from view. So now that we have two cylinders, these are both upright cylinders. If I wanted to make a set of cylinders, and I'll just move this over to the side so I can continue my notes, make a new layer. If I wanted to have a cylinder that's resting along this surface, I'm going to start out with a circle. And I'll draw another circle, and this time the circle will be halfway complete. I'll just draw some dotted lines, and I'll simply connect those two. Remember, the cylinder is a round object, so the contour is going to be round. And let me break this down to you in a way that is reproducible so that when you're practicing this, you'll be able to follow along. You start with a circle. You can draw some type of secondary circle. Draw some dotted lines and then connect the two. That's it. Alternatively, you could start with a circle, you could draw a line, and then you can create the end cap that way. Either way would work. I've shown different methods of this, like I've gone between both, whatever's easiest for you. The important thing is you start with a circle when you're having a cylinder that's resting along the surface of a grid. Okay, so now that we have that in place, let's talk about the cylinders that are, well, actually we'll talk about cones next, right? So just like the cylinder, the cone has an elliptical shape. That ellipse can be wider as long as it's still an elliptical shape. And you can put the point wherever you wish, connect the two, draw a few contours, and then you can simply get rid of the parts you don't want that are hidden from view. We'll do the same thing with a cone on the opposite side. And I'm always hitting my undo key when I'm not happy. Control Z is my friend. And so I've got this cone now resting along the surface. Again, these are ellipses. I'm also starting from the base. Even when I drew the cylinder, I started by drawing the shape that was on the surface, and then I projected upwards. I'm doing the same thing for an upright cone, right? So let's now draw a cone that appears to be resting along the surface. So just like the cylinder, we'll start out with a circle. We'll pick a point, and then we'll simply connect those 2 points. And my cone here is kind of inverting upward. It's kind of pointing in an upward direction because it's curved, but I could just as well draw a cylinder that does not have a curve to it. I'll just move this off to the side by drawing a circle, drawing a point, and simply connecting those 2 together. And now I've got a cone that appears to be resting along the grid. Okay, so we've talked about cylinders, we've talked about cones. Let's look at the tapered cylinder in this particular case. So that's going to work out pretty easily. Just like the regular cylinder, if we're drawing it upright, we're going to have an ellipse. And I can have some fun with this. I can actually go ahead and make a smaller circle and simply connect those 2 lines. Notice that I'm using my entire arm when I make those nice sweeping lines. This is a tapered cylinder that is upright. I'll move this over. And if I have a tapered cylinder, again, it's difficult to distinguish between a tapered cylinder and a normal cylinder when you're drawing it resting along a surface. So that's why I'm just going to add a little bit of a curvature. I'll make this cap noticeably smaller. And we have our tapered cylinder. So tapered cylinders are really one of the most important volumetric shapes that you'll encounter because it's so evident in nature. If you look at any stem from a rose, or if you look at a tree trunk, or even if you look at our arms, you'll see that this structure always appears to be there. You're starting out at a thicker side at the bottom and a thinner side up top. For example, if this is actually a tree, and we have branches, those branches are also essentially tapered cylinders. So being able to draw with these volumetric shapes are really, really helpful because if I wanted to place something on that tree trunk, or if I wanted to, cover it up, knowing where those contours are allows me to create something that fits that form. For example, if I had like a sheet of paper that I wanted to appear to be tacked on to that tree trunk, I could easily draw that and have it match the contours of the actual structure. For arms, you have tapered cylinders. You've got the upper arm, and then you've got the lower arm. And I'm not talking about musculature and all that because those are things that you add to. But this is why these structures are so important. Even the hand, you can represent that. Even fingers, for that matter, are essentially tapered cylinders. So knowing how to draw these structures and drawing them relatively large is really good practice for being able to draw the things that you want to draw. It's kind of like you have to learn the ABCs before you can start to write a beautiful paragraph. It's the same way here. And what makes using volumetric shapes really powerful is that you can then draw something from different angles. You're not stuck with just, I can only draw it in the same way that the reference is posed. I can turn this around and make it, in whatever direction I want it to be, whether I'm looking up at it, looking down at it, or looking at it from a different side. You can easily do that if you understand volumetric shapes. So if you found this video to be useful, please consider giving it a thumbs up. It's a little bit long, but I'm combining these volumetric shapes together into one big video. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.